Millionaire marries a nobody as a joke. Years later, he's on his knees before her. Enjoy the story and prepare for strong emotions and twists that will surprise you from start to finish. Ethan Crawford lived in a world where wealth was not just a symbol but the only measure of value. His mansion in Kensington, London, reflected his arrogant and unbeatable personality. Every marble wall, every crystal chandelier, was a declaration of his absolute power. He needed nothing more. Gala. Parties were constant, and everyone around him was there for one reason: to gain something he could offer. For Ethan, people were pieces on the grand chessboard of his game, and he was the only one holding the rules. With perfectly styled hair and a disdainful look for those he considered beneath his class, Ethan rarely cared about anything beyond his own amusement. His friends were as numerous as the notes in his bank account, but none of them were real. They were all fake, oppressed by their fascination with his status. He made no effort to hide his coldness. In his circle, everything was disposable. That night, Ethan was at yet another of his lavish parties. Slender women in expensive dresses, men in suits, fake laughter, and empty conversations. The loud music did not disguise the emptiness behind every gesture, but no one seemed to care. He was bored, yearning for some entertainment to break the monotony of his numbed world. And that's when one of his friends, James, had an absurd idea. "Why not play a game?" suggested James, with a mischievous smile. "Let's see if you can mold any woman to your liking, Ethan. A social experiment, if you will." Ethan raised an eyebrow. James always had strange ideas, but this one seemed fun. A nobody? Who would this woman be that could fit into Ethan's immaculate reality? He accepted the challenge without hesitation, laughing at himself, convinced he could dominate any situation. He had money, influence, and power. Nothing could go wrong. And who would this nobody be? Ethan asked, feigning disinterest, though amusement was already evident on his face. "Isla Bennett," James replied with a mocking tone. "A simple woman from the countryside with nothing to offer. It'll be fun to see you shape her." Ethan laughed. Isla Bennett, he knew nothing about her, but he knew that deep down, it didn't matter. He could change anyone, he could transform her into whatever he wanted. She would be just another piece on his control board. His smile widened as he imagined how easy it would be. A common woman wouldn't stand a chance against him. Soon her world would bow at his feet. Isla Bennett had no idea what was about to happen. The night was warm and stuffy. The golden lights of the chandeliers reflected off the crystal glasses, creating a glow that seemed to mimic the vanity of the guests. The hall was filled with dazzled people, all immersed in luxury, as if happiness could be bought with diamonds and champagne. Ethan Crawford stood, observing his friends with an arrogant smile, while holding a glass of wine. The loud music and fake laughter filled the air, but for Ethan everything felt empty and meaningless. Then James approached with that mischievous look on his face, as he always did when he had some absurd idea in mind. Ethan kept his eyes on him, waiting for another one of his jokes. James always liked to provoke, but today it seemed he was about to take the game further. "I have an idea," James said, leaning in toward Ethan. "Let's do something different. I want to see if you really are that powerful." Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious but not showing much interest. "And what do you have in mind?" James smiled challengingly. "You always talk about how you can control anyone, right? So, how about marrying a nobody? Someone simple with no value. A woman without glamour, nothing that compares to your world. A social experiment." Ethan's smile was instant, but his expression of superiority quickly turned into amusement. He was bored, and this seemed like a great way to have fun. "And you think I couldn't? Any woman, James. It doesn't matter how simple or insignificant she is. I can mold her." James, with a sparkle in his eyes, continued, "What if she's the simplest woman you've ever met? How about a woman from the countryside with no experience in this kind of life, and then you leave her in a state where she can't escape from you?" Ethan laughed. That was exactly what he wanted to hear. There was no challenge he couldn't face. There was no one he couldn't dominate. To him, people were just chess pieces in his power game. It was a joke to him, and this Isla Bennett from a distant village would certainly be just another piece in his collection of victories. So, that's it? I'm going to marry her? A nobody? For what? Ethan allowed himself to smile, already imagining how easy it would be. Yes, James replied with a wicked grin. Do whatever you want with her. The fun will be seeing how you manage to change her. I bet she'll bow before you in no time. Ethan, now completely convinced, accepted the challenge. He knew nothing could go wrong. I accept. It'll be too easy. He could already see himself in control, manipulating Isla Bennett as if she were a puppet. She would be just another victim of his arrogance, another woman who would fall under his power. The game was just beginning, and Ethan knew that in the end, he would be the winner. He could break anyone's life, and with Isla, he would do it. Spectacularly, Isla Bennett never imagined her life would take such an unexpected turn. A resident of a small village in Yorkshire, she had always led a simple life, full of meanings that the big city rarely understood. She grew up in a modest home, where hard work and respect for others were the pillars of life. Her mother, a strong woman, always told her that true wealth lay in actions, not in gold. Isla had a generous heart, a kindness that overflowed in every gesture. And although she lived far from luxuries, her spirit was richer than any mansion or collection of expensive cars. She loved her village with its quiet streets and the friendly faces of her neighbors. But fate sometimes plays unexpected pieces on the chessboard of life. The proposal came in a strange and disconcerting way. An elegant and arrogant man, coming from a world of wealth and ostentation, appeared at her door with an offer that seemed absurd. Ethan Crawford, a name Isla did not know but would soon discover was synonymous with power, money, and influence. He did not come to her because he admired or wished to know her. On the contrary, she was merely a disposable piece in his game of power. The invitation to marry him was not made with the delicacy one would deserve, but with the indifference of someone who feels they can do anything. "You will marry me," he said, in a voice so cold that Isla could hardly believe what she was hearing. There was no room for questions or arguments. He treated her as if she were a commodity, a trophy from a bet he was about to win. His indifference, his disdain did not go unnoticed by Isla. It was as if she were merely a piece on a chessboard, and he had already made his move. But Isla was no fool. Although her life was simple, she had a keen instinct. Something inside her told her that this encounter was not a coincidence, but a test, a provocation. She felt the humiliation in those words, but at the same time, something in her soul ignited. She was not the type of woman to submit to this provocation without reflecting on her own choices. She accepted the invitation, but not without making a silent promise to herself. This was not a game for her, nor was it a humiliation. Isla knew that her dignity could not be bought with diamond rings or the status of a forced marriage. She did not know how, but she knew she would come out of this story with her head held high, with or without Ethan's support. The wedding was set, and Isla felt a whirlwind of emotions. It was impossible to ignore the fact that this would be a step that would change her life forever. She did not know what role she was about to play in Ethan's game, but one thing was certain: he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The day of the wedding arrived, bringing with it a series of expectations that would never be fulfilled. Isla, in her simple yet elegantly understated dress, was led to the altar with the feeling that she was about to step onto a stage where the lights would focus solely on her humiliation. Ethan's mansion in Kensington was filled with the richest and most influential people in London, all eager to witness the billionaire's marriage to a woman of humble origins. Nothing could be more fitting for him, they thought. Ethan seemed oblivious to any emotion that might arise at that moment. He was dressed in the finest suit, exuding the coldness that had become his trademark. The wedding, for him, was merely a formality, a strategic move to prove that he could mold any woman to his liking, regardless of her background or social class. Isla was nothing more than an object in his collection of conquests. During the ceremony, he did not look at her with affection or warmth. On the contrary, he seemed distant, almost as if he were dealing with a business contract, not with the woman who was about to become his wife. The word love was never uttered during the vows, and the promises made at that altar were empty, devoid of any real commitment. The guests, all aligned with Ethan's status and arrogance, observed Isla with curious eyes. Some laughed softly, others murmured, amused by the situation. Isla, feeling like a fish out of water, tried to maintain her composure, but inside her, there was a silent struggle. What she feared most was coming true. She was being treated like a stranger, an intruder in Ethan's world. After the ceremony, the dinner was a parade of humiliations disguised as courtesies. Isla was ignored during conversations, sidelined in all interactions. Even when someone addressed her, it was with the condescending tone of someone speaking to someone unworthy of their attention. Ethan treated her with a disdain she never imagined she could endure. He humiliated her in small ways, like leaving her alone in a corner of the room while he chatted with others, or even ignoring her presence at social events. Isla began to realize how superficial and cruel Ethan's world truly was. The people around her were not there to get to know her, but to assess how well she could fit into the standards of a social game she never wanted to play. She was nothing more than a piece that should be shaped and defined by others. However, while Ethan's world seemed bright and full of promises, Isla began to see the emptiness behind the mask of his perfection. He, with all his power and influence, did not appear to be a successful man, but someone who used the facade of happiness to hide a lonely and empty soul. And although the contempt was evident, Isla could not help but feel a strange compassion for him, not because he deserved it, but because she knew that his arrogance was, in fact, a weakness he would never reveal. The marriage was undoubtedly loveless, but for Isla, it was already clear. This would not be the end of her story, but the beginning of something much deeper and transformative. The days following the wedding were a test of Isla's patience and dignity. With each social event, with each dinner, she found herself being treated as a decorative accessory, someone who was there merely to maintain appearances. Ethan, as always, remained distant and uninterested, ignoring his wife in favor of his own agenda and the trivialities around him. In the first few days, Isla tried to fit in, attempting to engage with the other guests, hoping to find some friendship, some sense of connection. However, she soon realized that others saw her merely as a curious exception in Ethan's life, a woman of no value who did not deserve their attention. The condescending glances and false smiles were constant, as if she were invisible to the eyes of high society. When someone greeted her, it was with empty courtesy, and they would quickly turn their backs to talk about other matters. The humiliations were subtle but relentless. Isla was used to a simple world where people treated each other with sincerity and respect. But here, in Ethan's mansion, everything seemed like a game of appearances, a stage where everyone dressed in happiness. But the truth behind the smiles was bitter and cruel. She was constantly ignored, sidelined in conversations, and when someone finally addressed her, it was with a tone of forced sympathy, as if she were a lost child waiting to be guided. During one dinner, one of Ethan's friends made a tasteless joke about her, a joke about her humble origins and simple appearance. Everyone around laughed, including Ethan, who found amusement in the situation. Isla, her face flushed with embarrassment, tried to smile, but the humiliation ran deep. Each small humiliation accumulated like a wound in her soul, but she remained steadfast. Deep down, she knew that the disdain she received said nothing about who she was, but rather about the emptiness of those around her. Ethan's arrogance and that of the people surrounding him was like a mask they wore to hide their own insecurities. However, Isla began to learn something valuable from her observations. She started to realize that Ethan's society was nothing more than a facade of beauty and wealth, where everyone hid behind their privileges to conceal their weaknesses. The jokes, the glances, and the empty words did not affect Isla as much as they once had. She was beginning to understand the game she was in, and more importantly, she was starting to protect herself. But the humiliation did not come only from outside. The pain also came from Ethan. He treated her as an insignificant presence, a part of his life he wished to forget, a flaw in his perfect world. He never called her by her name in public, referring to her only as my wife, in a disinterested and distant tone. She knew that to him she was nothing more than an object in his bets, a piece he used to prove his power. Isla's heart, however, remained strong. In her lonely nights, while Ethan lost himself in his parties and business meetings, Isla began to make plans in secret. She already knew what she needed to do. The first step toward her freedom would be to start understanding the world she was, in not just physically but also intellectually. She became an observer, absorbing every detail of Ethan's business dealings and relationships. He underestimated her, believing she was weak and naive, but Isla knew she had an inner strength he could never imagine. She began to study, to learn about finance and negotiations. She read about business, learning about strategy and psychology. Isla was slowly preparing for something greater, something Ethan could never foresee. She knew that one day her time would come, and when it did, he would feel the most painful loss of his life. Isla spent days and nights immersed in her silent world of learning and observation. While the world around her spun in a routine of luxury, superficiality, and coldness, she used every moment to strengthen herself in a way that no one, not even Ethan, could perceive. With her sharp intellect and determination, she decided she would no longer be the silent and submissive wife. She knew she had to become something much stronger. At first, she tried to get closer to Ethan, attempting to reach his heart, but he did not see her. He treated her with the same disdain, the same indifference he showed to everyone around him. Each of her attempts to establish a genuine connection was rejected, and Isla understood that she could not wait for him. She would need a plan to reverse the dynamic between them. Instead of lamenting or succumbing to daily humiliation, she decided to invest in herself. Isla enrolled in online courses, read books on leadership, finance, and psychology. At first, it was difficult. Reading about business and management felt distant from the simple reality of her previous life. But, as always, she clung to her tenacity and dedication. Her mind opened to new possibilities. She began to see patterns and opportunities in Ethan's conversations and business dealings, something that had previously seemed out of reach. During Ethan's meetings, when he was absorbed with his business colleagues or friends, Isla began to pay attention to the flaws and weaknesses in his way of handling things. She noticed how he made impulsive decisions, how his choices were more based on ego than on rationality. Isla knew that Ethan thought his wealth and status were enough to guarantee his success, but she was starting to realize that behind the facade of power, he was vulnerable. It was then that she made a crucial decision. She would start studying Ethan's business, analyzing investments, understanding where he was going wrong, and, more importantly, begin to become an indispensable woman for him. She knew that at the right moment, she would need to be the only one who could help him rise again, and that would put her in a position of power he could never imagine. In the days that followed, Isla continued her learning in secret. At the same time, she began to invest in her appearance and posture. She started wearing more refined clothes, applying makeup more subtly to reflect the growing confidence within her. She wanted to be recognized, no longer as the wife chosen by a bet, but as an independent and capable woman. Meanwhile, Ethan continued lost in his own world of parties and business, unaware of the gradual transformation occurring around him. He still saw Isla as a piece of his past, someone he ignored without any remorse, but she was no longer the same woman. Her silent strength was taking shape, and behind every polite smile and every kind word, there was a plan in motion. Isla also began to cultivate a network of contacts, approaching influential people in Ethan's circle, but with a crucial difference. She was not trying to please them. She was observing and learning. Gradually, she became a presence that everyone paid attention to, even if they did not fully understand why. She was more than just Ethan's forgotten wife. She was becoming a woman with a purpose, with ambition, and more importantly, with power over time. Isla knew that the moment to act was approaching. When the right moment arrived, she would be ready to deliver the final blow, not to Ethan, but to the system he represented. She was prepared to show that, while he built his fortune on the weaknesses of others, she had rebuilt her own strength from her adversities. The gala event in question was undoubtedly one of the biggest nights of the social season in London. The mansion was filled with influential, wealthy, and famous people. The sound of conversations mingled with the clinking of champagne glasses, and the elegant outfits sparkled under the soft light of the chandeliers. Once again, Ethan was at the center of attention, radiating confidence and power. Isla stood by his side as always, but in a way only she understood. Silent, observant, and, to some extent, invisible. He was engrossed in conversations with other guests, discussing business as he always did. Isla, however, felt the pressure building within her. Each false smile, each cutting word, each disdainful glance from Ethan and those around him made her feel increasingly suffocated. The pressure of constant humiliation was becoming unbearable, and she knew something had to change. She could no longer endure this cycle of pain and contempt. It was during one of those moments of pure disdain that the last straw finally broke. Ethan, in his typical arrogance, made a cruel joke about Isla in front of a group of influential people. She didn't know if he truly believed she was there merely as a trophy, an insignificant figure in his life, or if he did it purely for amusement. But what she did know, and what hit her hard, was that he didn't see her as even human, just a piece in his game. Isla felt the humiliation cut through her like a blade. She smiled, wearing the mask of disgust well, and quietly stepped away. In that moment, she made a choice that would change the course of her life. She no longer needed Ethan's approval, or that of high society, to be happy. She would no longer allow him to use her and treat her as if she were nothing. She discreetly withdrew from the party, and at that moment, Isla vanished from Ethan's life as suddenly as she had silently appeared. She left no note, said not a word. She simply disappeared. Ethan, unaware, was being stripped of something far more valuable than he imagined. He, who had always believed he had control over everything and everyone, didn't know what to do when Isla exited his life. It was not just the absence of his wife. It was the emptiness in his own heart that was now beginning to open up, an abyss he hadn't known existed, until he felt the loss. In the days that followed, Ethan grew restless. He tried to locate Isla, sending messages and asking questions, but she gave no sign of life. He was used to being the center of attention, always surrounded by people, always in control, but Isla was no longer there. Her silence became even more deafening, and with it he began to realize how deeply she had impacted his life. Isla knew what she was doing. She had stepped away to rebuild herself, to become someone who would no longer depend on anyone. She understood that she needed to take this step, to make this master move to free herself and begin reconstructing her life. And more importantly, she knew that one day he would come looking for her. She was preparing for that moment, and from there, everything would change. The silence that followed Isla's departure was deafening. Ethan, who was accustomed to being the center of attention, was gradually consumed by a sense of loss he didn't know how to handle. Life, which had once seemed impeccably controlled, was now crumbling around him. In the first few days, he tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He continued attending the same social circles, maintaining his business, meetings and extravagant parties, but something was missing. With each meeting, each false smile, each distant glance from his friends and colleagues, he felt a growing emptiness inside. Ethan's business began to show signs of weakness. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but the decisions that once seemed obvious were becoming increasingly difficult to make. The empire he had built over the years was starting to sway, as if it were shattering without him realizing it. Friends who had once fawned over him began to drift away. Those who were only interested in his fortune and status realized that his presence no longer meant anything. Ethan's power, which had been sustained by his wealth and social position, was dissipating, and he was powerless to stop it. Deep down, Ethan knew that the reason everything was falling apart was Isla's absence. She had always been the silent foundation of his life, the person who made him feel real, the one who, despite all the humiliations, genuinely loved him. He, who had treated her like a disposable piece, now felt the weight of her absence like never before. Meanwhile, Isla was far from the vulnerable woman he believed her to be. She was no longer in his shadow, no longer at the mercy of his humiliations. She was rebuilding herself, strengthening herself, and now, as the distance between them grew, Ethan's awareness of how deeply he had underestimated her began to take shape. He finally realized that he no longer had control over anything, and that what truly mattered had vanished. Ethan didn't know what to do with this new reality. He had everything money could buy, but he lacked what could not be purchased: truth, love, and respect. Each day that passed without Isla, he found himself more lost in a sea of regrets. Money, power, luxury cars, and mansions meant nothing now. What he desired more than anything else was the chance to look into Isla's eyes again, to ask for forgiveness, and perhaps, who knows, to redeem himself. But time was running out. The empire he had taken years to build was now being consumed by the very contempt and arrogance he had nurtured. Ethan Crawford's downfall was just beginning, and he barely knew how difficult it would be to try to rebuild what he had lost. It was as if the ground had been ripped from beneath Ethan's feet, and he was falling into an endless abyss. The signs were everywhere, but he refused to see them. Now the damage was visible and undeniable. The weeks of financial crisis reached a peak, and the empire he had built with such pride was disintegrating at an alarming rate. Investments began to fail. Businesses that had once been sources of great profit started to accumulate losses. The real estate market, where he held a significant portion of his fortune, collapsed. Stocks that had once been stable began to plummet. Debts piled up, and suddenly, Ethan found himself with a noose around his neck. In the height of his despair, he called a meeting with his financial advisors. Sitting at the table in his enormous mansion with a pale face and wide eyes, Ethan listened in disbelief to the news of imminent bankruptcy. "Mr. Crawford, your situation is unsustainable. There's no way to reverse this. We are on the brink of total collapse." The words echoed in his mind like a hammer striking his head. The consultants, those men and women who had once been eager to follow all his orders, now avoided looking him in the eye. The arrogance he exuded had been replaced by a sense of helplessness he didn't know how to handle. He, who had always controlled everything around him, was now powerless. The phone calls that had once been answered with a smile and a promise of solutions were now met with apologies and empty explanations. The Kensington mansion, which had once been a symbol of his greatness, was put up for sale. Offers began to come in, but none approached the value he expected. It was as if the world was pulling away from him, and the luxury he had once cherished was now in ruins. His collection of luxury cars was also auctioned off, and to his humiliation, many of the most precious items were sold for a fraction of their original value. As he watched the auction, his heart sank. People laughed as his possessions were acquired for a pittance. What had once been a symbol of his achievement was now a reminder of his decline. The most painful aspect, however, was Isla's absence. He felt in every piece of his downfall that losing her was among the greatest reasons for his collapse. He wondered if she knew, if she was watching from a distance, and if she felt any satisfaction in what was happening to him. Memories flooded his mind of the times he had ignored her, when he had treated her as an insignificant piece. Now, he knew she held the key to his heart and his redemption. But pride and vanity prevented him from seeking her out immediately. It was as if the world had turned upside down, and Ethan was, for the first time, directionless. As he found himself isolated in his empty mansion, with bankruptcy papers scattered across the table, he felt a mix of regret and shame. He knew he would never be the same. Money, fame, power. All that he thought was the secret to happiness was now nothing but dust. He needed Isla. But at the same time, he knew it might be too late. The night was illuminated by bright lights, and the city of Manhattan seemed to pulse with its frenetic and unbeatable rhythm. It was one of the biggest parties of the year, hosted by one of the most influential figures in the financial sector. But something different was happening that night. The place was filled with powerful people, but among all the familiar faces and celebrities, there was a mysterious presence that drew glances from every corner. Isla Bennett entered the room with a confidence that was completely new to her. From her humble beginnings in Yorkshire, she never imagined she would one day be at an event of this magnitude, surrounded by executives and billionaires being noticed so clearly. But now she was no longer the woman ignored by Ethan Crawford. She was no longer the wife who had been despised and humiliated in her own home. Her transformation was evident. She wore an elegant gala dress in a deep shade of blue that perfectly matched her now more resolute and determined eyes. Her once simple hair was impeccably styled, and her smile radiated an inner strength that few could comprehend. Isla was now the kind of woman who commanded attention without needing to lift a finger. She didn't care about the admiring glances that followed her as she crossed the room. In fact, she didn't even notice the sighs of the men around her, or the whispers of the women, who watched her with a mix of envy and curiosity. Isla knew very well that the true transformation was happening within. She was not there to please anyone, especially Ethan. She had a much greater mission: to show the world that the woman he had scorned had become someone unattainable and successful, someone who no longer needed his validation. Isla was in control of her own life, of her own narrative. She was no longer the nobody he thought she would be forever. And then, when her eyes met Ethan Crawford's for the first time in years, she saw the disbelief and shock in his gaze. He looked lost, as if he were in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. However, there was no longer room for compassion in Isla. She saw him standing there, surrounded by his old entourage of friends, but he was no longer the center of attention as he once was. Ethan tried to mask his surprise, but the truth was undeniable. The woman he had despised had transformed into something he could no longer control. And worst of all, she was more powerful than he had ever imagined. Isla smiled, but it was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of silent victory, making it clear that she had already overcome everything he had done to her. When Ethan approached, trying to regain the confidence he had always possessed, she ignored him with the same coldness with which he had treated her all those years. Isla was beyond that now. She had grown, and her journey had shaped her in a way he could never comprehend. Isla Bennett was no longer the lost wife. She was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and how to achieve her goals. And if Ethan ever thought he could mold her, he now saw that he himself had been shaped by the wheel of fate, which was now turning in her favor. The party hall was vibrant with laughter, conversations, and loud music, but none of it seemed to reach Ethan. He stood frozen, watching Isla from across the room. The years had been generous to her, but it wasn't just her appearance that left him stunned. It was the confidence she exuded, something he had never seen in that woman. Ethan had everything he wanted, or at least he thought he did. He had always believed that money and power were the keys to dominating any situation, to controlling people, even those he despised. But there, before him, was proof that he was wrong. Isla, with her distant smile and proud posture, didn't care about his presence. She seemed completely oblivious to the fact that he, the man who had once dominated her, was now there, at the mercy of her indifference. And that was eating him alive from the inside out. Ethan took a deep breath and tried to compose himself. He approached her with hesitant steps, as if each movement were heavy. When Isla noticed him, her eyes did not shine with joy or surprise. On the contrary, she looked at him with a cold calmness, as if he were just another person in the room. He tried to smile, but her expression did not change. She was relentless. "Isla," Ethan began, his voice trembling. "It's good to see you again." Isla did not respond immediately. She turned to him slowly, assessing him, as if she were pondering whether to spend another second of her life with the man who had humiliated her. "You have the audacity to speak to me?" she finally asked, with the same coldness he had used to ignore her so many times in the past. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling his face flush for the first time in years. He was used to being respected, even feared, but in front of Isla, he was nothing. I know I did terrible things, but I've changed, Isla. I need you to believe me. I am a different man now." She stared at him in silence for a few seconds, before responding, her voice calm and cutting. "Do you think words can erase what happened, Ethan? That you can just show up after years and ask for forgiveness? You underestimated me more than anyone." Ethan felt the weight of her words, as if each one were a sharp blade cutting through his arrogance and pride. He knew that his apologies meant nothing. He was losing the only chance he had to redeem himself. Isla took a step back and looked at him once more, as if deciding whether to let him drown in his own shame or somehow give him a chance. But her expression was unyielding. There was nothing he could do to change what had happened. Time did not rewind, and he knew he had no control over anything, not even over her. "You made your choice, Ethan, and now it's too late," she said, turning away with the grace of a woman who was completely at peace with her decision. Ethan stood there, paralyzed, watching Isla walk away. She did not look back, and he knew in that moment that he had lost what mattered most. There was nothing he could do to win her back. She was already beyond him, beyond everything he knew. And he could do nothing but watch as his life crumbled. Even further, the event was in full swing, but for Ethan, nothing else mattered. He couldn't take his eyes off Isla, who was at the center of a group of people. She was talking to an influential businesswoman, laughing and displaying a natural charm. The contrast between the woman he had scorned and the powerful woman before him was immeasurable. Ethan felt a growing urgency. He needed to talk to her. He needed to apologize, to confess his regret. But more than anything, he desperately needed Isla to see that he had changed. The man who once humiliated her no longer existed, or at least he wanted to believe that. He crossed the hall toward Isla, feeling the weight of the gazes upon him. He was used to attention, to smiles and nods of approval, but now, what consumed him was the fear of what might happen when he finally stood before her. When he got close enough for her to notice, Isla looked at him with a brief smile, but it was not inviting. She didn't seem surprised to see him there, but her expression clearly showed that she was distant, far removed from everything he represented. "Ethan," Isla said, with a lightness that did not match the gravity of the moment. "What a surprise. To see you here. I thought you had disappeared from my radar." Her voice was like a sharp blade. There were no traces of the vulnerable Isla he remembered, that young woman with a shy smile and hopeful eyes. She was someone else now, someone who had moved on and left him behind. "Isla, please," Ethan began, his voice tense. "I know I can never erase what I did, but I need you to know how much I regret it, how much I hurt you, and how much I've changed since then. I'm not the same man who looked down on you." Gisela watched him in silence, her eyes no longer reflecting the pain of the past, but rather an unshakable calm. She had read his words before, had seen that plea in his voice. She was no longer willing to be deceived by empty promises. "And you? Think that's enough?" she asked, the coldness in her voice more pronounced now. "Do you think I can just accept what you did and move on as if nothing happened? That you can erase years of humiliation with empty words?" Ethan swallowed hard, a knot tightening in his throat. He knew he was lost, that the words he had spoken were not enough, but still he pressed on. "Isla, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I've changed. I want the chance to show you who I am now, without the lies, without the arrogance." She looked at him with an intensity that made his heart race. For a moment he thought she might say something, but she fell silent and shook her head. "I don't know if you've really changed, Ethan," she said calmly, "but I know what I went through and what I learned, and I can't go back. I can't put my heart at risk again, Not after everything you did to me." Ethan felt the pain of rejection cut through his soul like a blade. He knew he had lost her. Isla was no longer the woman he could control with his money and influence. She was strong, independent, and distant. He wanted to blame himself, wanted to drown in his own failures. But deep down, what hurt him most was the pain of seeing how much he had underestimated her. "I know I hurt you," he said, his voice low, "but I will never give up trying. I will never give up asking for forgiveness, trying to win you back. I just need one more chance." Isla looked at him for a long time, her face unyielding, showing no signs of being moved. She knew he was suffering, but she also knew that wasn't enough. Regret could not erase years of pain. "You have a lot to prove, Ethan," she finally replied, her voice soft but filled with certainty. "But for now, words are just that, words, and they can no longer reach me." With those words, she turned away, leaving Ethan alone in the middle of the hall. He stood there like a defeated man, watching the woman he had lost, knowing that perhaps it was too late to turn back. Ethan stood there frozen, his gaze fixed on the spot where Isla had disappeared into the crowd. His mind was clouded, confused, and filled with a tumult of thoughts. He knew that her rejection would not be easily overcome, but the weight of her words, her firm refusal, consumed him in a way he hadn't expected. He felt the growing emptiness in his chest, as if his soul had been ripped away and left adrift. It was then that he heard a soft yet firm voice beside him. "You underestimated me," Isla said, approaching Ethan with a look that carried a defiant tranquility. She watched him intently, her blue eyes shining under the event's lights. There was something different about her now, something Ethan couldn't quite identify. It wasn't just the physical transformation he had noticed earlier. There was a confidence in her posture, a peace that he knew he could not take from her. Isla crossed her arms and gave a slight, ironic smile. "Do you really think you know me? That you understand what I went through because of you?" She paused, as if waiting for him to grasp the depth of what she was about to say. "I was a simple girl, with no pretensions. When you entered my life, everything changed. I believed in you, trusted your words, but what you did was turn me into a toy for your amusement, Ethan. I was nothing more than a pastime for you." Her gaze hardened, but her voice remained calm, as if the pain of the past had already been overcome. "You and your friends had fun at my expense, watching me, laughing, treating me as if I were invisible. But I saw everything. I saw every look of disdain, every whispered word behind my back." Ethan felt the weight of each word hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had never imagined that she had noticed, or that she cared enough to remember. But she did. And more than that, she used it to rebuild herself, to become the woman standing before him now. "I learned the hard way," Isla continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I learned that a person's worth is not in what they wear or the society they belong to. It's in their ability to rise, to stand up after being knocked down." She took a step closer to him, her presence now imposing. "When you humiliated me, Ethan, you didn't break me. Not in the way you imagined. I grew. And it was the pain, the rejection, that made me stronger. I began to see the world differently and started to believe in my own worth." Ethan remained silent, his eyes searching for the Isla he thought he knew. But this woman before him was different. She was no longer the fragile young woman he had discarded. She was someone with purpose, someone who had found her way without him. "I didn't need you to become who I am now," Isla said, with a cruelty that was almost light. "And, honestly, I don't know if I want to allow you to be part of that. I built my life without you, and it is more valuable than anything you could offer me." Isla's words fell heavily on his heart. He had never imagined she could transform in this way, to become so independent and powerful. The pain of loss no longer stemmed solely from her rejection, but from the brutal realization that he had lost her in a way he could not control. He had never thought someone like her could walk away and move on, but she had. "I understand," Ethan finally said, his voice hoarse. "I underestimated you, and I lost the best part of myself when I treated you that way." Isla looked at him with a mix of indifference and understanding, as if she already knew this was the only kind of regret he could offer. Yes, you lost, and perhaps it's too late to recover. With that, she turned her back and walked away, leaving Ethan once again in silence, alone amidst the world of glitz and superficiality that he had once dominated so easily. Ethan stood there, his heart racing. Every word Isla had said still echoed in his mind. He knew he was being confronted by the woman he had neglected, the woman he believed to be fragile and easy to manipulate. But now, with her back, he felt the weight of his own insignificance. He watched her walk away, her posture upright, as if she were determined to move on, even without him. Something inside him tightened, a strange feeling he had never experienced before. Regret, perhaps, or simply the emptiness of loss that he had never imagined feeling. But the silence between them was interrupted when Isla stopped and slowly turned, her eyes fixed on his. She studied him, as if evaluating what he truly was. There was something in her that Ethan couldn't understand, something he had never seen in her expression before. Compassion. But it wasn't compassion in the sense he expected. It wasn't a compassion he could shelter under. It was a distant, almost impersonal compassion, as if she had overcome everything he had put her through. "Do you think you can apologize now, Ethan?" Isla's voice cut through the air, direct and unadorned. "Do you think a simple 'I'm sorry' will erase everything you did? Do you think things can go back to normal?" Ethan swallowed hard. Her words hit him with the force of a punch, more painful than any public humiliation he had faced. He knew he couldn't expect her to forgive him immediately. He understood that he had hurt Isla in ways he didn't fully comprehend. But still, the desire to have a chance to reclaim what he had lost consumed him. "I don't expect you to forgive me now," Ethan said, his voice trembling with the intensity of what he felt. "I know I'm asking for something impossible, but what I want, Isla, is a chance to show that I'm a different man. I lost myself, and I see that now. I see the pain I caused, and I regret it." Isla watched him in silence for a moment. Her blue eyes were like deep oceans, impossible to read, impenetrable. But there was something in them, a spark of something Ethan couldn't identify. Perhaps it was pain, perhaps compassion, or maybe it was just a reflection of what he had truly lost, the opportunity to be better. "You don't understand, Ethan," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "I'm not the same person you ignored, and I won't go back in time. What happened between us was a lesson for me, a lesson about who I am, about my worth, and about what I deserve. I don't need your approval, I don't need your validation, and I certainly don't need your forgiveness to move on." Ethan felt the weight of her words like a dead weight in his chest. He looked at her, and for the first time, he felt small, as if all the masks he had worn over the years had fallen away, leaving him vulnerable and exposed before her. "I know you don't need me," he replied with a heavy sigh, his eyes softening. "But I need you, Isla. I need to show you that I can be different, that I can learn. And maybe, just maybe, if you give me a chance, I can prove that I am a man worthy of you." Isla took a deep breath and took a small step back. "I don't know if I can give you that chance, Ethan. Maybe you have changed. Maybe you are regretful. But what I know is that you need to prove it, not just to me, but to yourself." She turned slowly and began to walk away, not saying another word. Before she turned the corner, she paused and, without looking back, said softly, "But who knows? Maybe in the future, when you truly find yourself, we might cross paths again. And if it's meant to be, perhaps I'll be willing to listen to you again." Ethan stood there, his heart tight and a deeper sense of loss washing over him. But something inside him knew that this was the opportunity he needed. He would have to prove, not to her, but to himself, that he could change, that he could be a man worthy of what he now desired, a chance at redemption. Ethan was alone in his office, the soft light of late afternoon streaming through the window, but nothing seemed to illuminate his heavy heart. The mansion that had once been his fortress of luxury now felt like a prison, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. He looked at the table before him, cluttered with documents and business papers that no longer mattered. The empire he had built was crumbling, and with it, his certainties. But that afternoon, he made a decision. He knew time was against him. Isla had been clear. He could not expect her to forgive everything with just words. She needed to see something more. He needed to do something more. In the following days, Ethan acted in ways he never imagined he was capable of. The mask of arrogance was replaced by the face of the real man he had been afraid to be. He began to seek ways to rebuild his life, not through wealth or power, but through hard work, humility, and a genuine desire to change. But none of it seemed enough. Isla was not there to witness his transformation, and he knew that the only way to truly show her he had changed was to do something meaningful, something she could never ignore. Then he had an idea, a simple yet profound idea. He knew that Isla, despite everything that had happened, still cared about him in some way, even if she wouldn't admit it. He needed to do something that demonstrated without words how much she still meant to him. The next day, Ethan went to one of the few places where he still felt some connection to his former self. An exclusive jewelry store he used to frequent. A place where he always spent large sums without thinking. But this time, he entered with a sense of vulnerability, a stark contrast to his former self. "I need something very special," he told the jeweler. "Something symbolic that shows how valuable someone is, not by price but by meaning." The jeweler, surprised by the change in his demeanor, nodded. "Something that symbolizes regret? Or perhaps redemption?" Ethan agreed with a slight nod, his mind focused on a single goal: to find something that could be proof of his transformation. He carefully observed the jewelry until his eyes landed on a simple piece, but one loaded with symbolism. A delicate necklace with a pendant shaped like a tree, representing growth, change, and renewal. That was exactly what he wanted to convey to Isla, the desire to reinvent himself, to rise from the ashes of his mistakes. He bought the necklace and tucked it away in his drawer, waiting for the right moment to present it to her. The moment came weeks later. Isla was at an event in the city, a closed event for an even more exclusive elite than anything Ethan had experienced before. He knew this would be his last chance to show her that the change was real. Ethan approached the event with a tight heart. He had restarted his life modestly, without ostentation, but he knew that the true test of his regret lay in the sincerity of his gestures. When he saw Isla in the hall, surrounded by others, his heart raced. She looked even more beautiful, more powerful, more unattainable. But now he saw her differently. With humility and genuine remorse, he approached her, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Isla, I know that nothing I say can erase what I did. But please, accept this as a symbol of my regret and my desire to change." He extended his hand, holding the delicate necklace out to her, his gesture sincere and vulnerable. Isla looked at him, surprised, but said nothing. She took the necklace, studying it for a moment, as if deciding something. Ethan could see that. She was moved, but he didn't know what she was thinking. After a long silence, she looked at him, her eyes shining with a mix of pain and something else. Perhaps hope. Perhaps disbelief. "You finally understood," she said softly. "But understanding doesn't mean the path will be easy." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief mixed with immense fear. "I know, Isla, and I'm willing to walk that path, for you, for me, if you'll allow me." She carefully tucked the necklace away, and for a moment he felt as if she were emotionally distancing herself. But before he could say more, she looked at him and, with an expression difficult to decipher, said, "I will think about it, Ethan. Not because you asked me to, but because you showed me you are willing to change. That's all you can do right now. The rest is up to me." Ethan stood there, his chest tight, but at the same time feeling that he had finally taken the first true step toward redemption. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but at least now, he knew he was doing the right thing. Ethan's life was beginning to show signs of transformation, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. He had started working on a modest project, far from the spotlight and the dazzling wealth that had once been his reality. Yet with each passing day, the absence of Isla hit him harder. The necklace was still tucked away, a constant reminder of his attempt at redemption. He knew that Isla was still watching him from a distance, but she was not letting herself be reached. She had challenged him to prove that he had truly changed, without empty promises, without illusions. And that was harder than anything he had faced before. He found himself constantly questioning what real change meant. It was no longer about money or status. It was no longer about controlling the lives of others. It was about humility, about living with purpose and acting authentically. Isla had been the key to this transformation, and he knew that if he wanted a chance to win her heart back, he would need to be patient and let time do its work. One day, Ethan received a letter from Isla while he was at his small house in the suburbs of London. His heart raced at the sight of the seal. The content was straightforward, without embellishments. "Ethan, the change you've shown hasn't gone unnoticed. But I want to be clear. What happened between us cannot be erased overnight. I can't simply forget everything that happened. You asked me to prove that you are willing to change. Now you need to prove that to yourself before anything else. I will give a second chance, but only if you understand what that truly means." Isla's words resonated in Ethan's mind. He felt a mix of relief and apprehension. A second chance? For him, that meant more than he could express. He knew that Isla's forgiveness would not come easily, but he was willing to do the impossible to earn it. What she asked was simple, yet complicated. He needed to prove that he wasn't just acting out of convenience, but out of a genuine, profound change. A change that was visible, not just empty words. A change that would make him worthy of the forgiveness she still held in her heart. Ethan reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the impact of his actions, how he had treated her, how he had humiliated her. But he also thought about how much he had changed. He was no longer the arrogant, selfish man she had known. He didn't know if Isla would see that, but he was determined to show her. With that in mind, he decided to follow a path he had never imagined for himself. He would begin to rebuild not just his financial life, but also his soul. He needed to prove to Isla, but above all, he needed to prove to himself that the change was real. Ethan woke up early, as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. He had left behind his old life, the luxury, the endless parties, the false friends who had only been around because of his fortune. Now he was facing a new reality, simple and challenging. The house he rented in a humble neighborhood in London didn't have the sophisticated furniture of his mansion, but it had something more important: peace. He looked out the window, observing the movement of the street. The sound of the city felt different, more real. No luxury cars, just ordinary vehicles and people rushing by, their eyes focused on their routines. There was no admiration in their gazes, no respect for his wealth, as there once had been, but he didn't care. He needed a break from the world that had consumed him. Ethan was determined to start anew, but he didn't know where to begin. He had lost his financial empire, his companies had failed, and his friends had drifted away. What was left? He started with the basics, finding a job, something that would connect him to the real world, something that would make him work like anyone else. That's how he landed a job at a small consulting firm. It wasn't glamorous, nor was it close to his former life, but for him, it meant starting from scratch, without shortcuts, without haste. What bothered him most was the fact that he still hadn't seen Isla. She had completely distanced herself, and he knew that time was against him. He remembered the letter she had sent him. It was an opportunity, but also a challenge. Isla wanted to see if he had truly changed. It wouldn't be enough to just humble himself or try to impress her with grand gestures. She wanted to see a man capable of facing life without the distractions of his wealth, someone who could understand the value of every action, no matter how small. The work at the consulting firm wasn't easy. He was used to making quick decisions, to controlling situations. But now he was a subordinate, with simple, often repetitive tasks, and without the glamour of high society. However, each time he sat at the table, he felt more honored by it. It was the first real step in his journey of redemption. He was beginning to understand what Isla meant by proving the change. It wasn't about money or status. He needed to rebuild his character, his heart, and his connection to the real world. Each day at work was a lesson in patience and humility, something he would never have learned in his old life of excess. Isla, for her part, watched from a distance, though without revealing her presence. She had heard of his first steps toward humility and hard work, and that in some way touched her. But she still didn't know if she could trust him again. Time would tell. Ethan knew that the road ahead would be long, perhaps longer than he had imagined. He was still at the beginning of his journey, but now he saw a possible future. The regret he felt was no longer a burden but a motivation. Ethan's phone vibrated on the table of his small apartment, interrupting the silence that accompanied him every morning. He looked at the unknown number on the screen and hesitated for a moment. Who could it be? His thoughts drifted for an instant, and he allowed himself to reflect on his current life. Simple, but with a clear purpose. On one hand, he was grateful for the routine, for the hard work that he was finally beginning to understand the value of. On the other, the emptiness of Isla's absence still haunted him. He answered the phone, unaware that the call would change everything. It was from an important client of the company he worked for, offering him a unique opportunity. The situation involved a complex negotiation between two major companies, and Ethan, with his experience, would be the ideal person to handle the strategy and communication. There was a significant corporate event scheduled for the following week in Manhattan, and expectations were high. Ethan felt immediately torn. This was his chance to rebuild his career, to regain a voice in the business world, but it was also a risk. He knew the event would be a minefield, as he could run into people he knew, and most importantly, Isla. She was back on the social scene, and the mere fact that they would be in the same city could be a decisive test. But he couldn't back down. The job was not only a chance to prove himself, but also an opportunity for a fresh start. Moreover, if something happened, he would have the chance to see Isla and finally confront the pain of the past. In the days that followed, Ethan prepared like never before. He not only studied every detail of the negotiation, but also dedicated himself to improving his interpersonal skills. He knew that more than ever, he needed to be someone genuine, someone who had truly learned the lesson. On the eve of the event, nervousness consumed him. Looking in the mirror, Ethan could barely recognize the man staring back at him. He was no longer the arrogant millionaire who once looked at himself with pride. He was a man seeking redemption. What he didn't know was that Isla was also preparing for that day, with a firm resolve and determined not to yield. The event took place in the heart of Manhattan, in a luxurious hotel filled with lights and attentive gazes. Ethan, now dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, felt out of place, as if the weight of his past was visible with every step. As he entered the hall, the atmosphere was charged with expectations. He quickly realized that the tension was greater than he had imagined. His eyes began to search for Isla, even though he didn't want to admit how much he longed to see her. And then, amidst the crowd, he saw her. Isla was there, as always, imposing, but now with an aura of power he had never imagined. She was radiant, even more enchanting than before, and her gaze, which had always unsettled him, now seemed insurmountable. She was surrounded by influential figures from the business world, but there was no doubt she was no longer in that fragile and manipulable universe of the past. Ethan's gaze met Isla's for a brief moment, and he felt his heart race. It was shock. She was different, but so was he. She looked at him for an instant as if assessing every detail, and then turned away, as if she no longer saw him. The rejection was immediate. But more than the pain of being ignored, Ethan felt that this encounter would not be easy to forget. The event continued, and Ethan tried to focus on the work at hand, but Isla's presence seemed to dominate his thoughts. She was the woman he had humiliated, and now she was beyond his reach. The decisive moment had arrived. He would have to face the consequences of his mistakes, and perhaps it was too late. The night dragged on, but for Ethan, time seemed frozen. He found himself cornered in a part of the hall, unable to take his eyes off Isla. She was surrounded by important people, discussing business, but something in her posture made her seem unattainable. It was the perfect combination of strength and elegance, as if she had become something he could never reach. Her gaze was now more distant, more impenetrable, and Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. Suddenly, something pushed him forward. No longer arrogant, no longer the billionaire from Kensington, he felt small before his former wife. Shame, regret, and pain consumed him. He knew this was his last chance. The moment had come to be honest, not with others, but with himself. He needed to ask for forgiveness, but would she be able to listen? Through the crowd, he saw Isla moving away, heading toward a quieter area of the event. It was now or never. With his heart racing, Ethan followed her, disregarding social conventions. He was no longer interested in status or power, but in the woman he had once humiliated. "Isla," he called, his voice betraying the intensity of his plea. She turned, and their eyes met. For a brief moment, the world around them disappeared. Time seemed to stand still. The woman he had ignored, despised and underestimated, was standing before him, now stronger and more invincible than ever. Isla looked at him in silence, her face impassive, but her eyes, once filled with pain, now held something Ethan couldn't interpret. Perhaps sadness, perhaps indifference, perhaps even a hint of compassion. But whatever it was, Ethan could no longer maintain his posture of arrogance. He lowered his head, feeling a wave of humility he had never imagined experiencing. I know I can't erase what I did to you, Isla. I know I hurt you in ways no one could understand. But today, looking at you, I know I lost the best part of myself, and that's why I'm here. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I deserve it, but I need you to know that I deeply regret it, from the bottom of my heart." The silence between them was almost unbearable, but Ethan didn't pull away. He knew he couldn't do anything more, that all the words and actions that would follow would merely be attempts to rebuild what he had destroyed. So he stood there, waiting for a response,